Hey guys, welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions, and also as always, post all of your new questions and old questions that haven't been answered yet onto the bottom of this Patreon post. And also don't forget to like all the questions which you want answered, because I will answer the questions in order of how many likes they have. So let's get going. Palm Trees asks, I think a lot of your viewers would absolutely love to see you do a video with Dogen. An interview and or pitch accent discussion would be really entertaining. Have you tried reaching out to him, or is it something that doesn't really interest you? Well, I haven't reached out to him, but I have had small Twitter exchanges here and there, and I would love to make a video with Dogen. I think, we could probably have really interesting discussions on pitch accent and learning Japanese to a high level in general. And yeah, I haven't reached out personally, but if he reached out to me, I'd totally be down. Perhaps I'll reach out eventually. Just right now, I'm pretty busy, and I already have a giant long list of things that I want to make for my own channel just on my own, and so it's not really a priority to collaborate with other people. I pretty much just collaborate with other people when they reach out to me, because if they went out of their way to do that, I normally clear out my schedule and make sure that I'll do that. But yeah, as of right now, I don't have any plans to go out of my way to reach out to him. If he reached out to me, I would clear my schedule, and I'd definitely love to do something. And perhaps at some point in the future, I will reach out when I don't have as many things that I'm currently wanting to create just on my own. Palm Trees also asks, is there anything about the Japanese language you don't like and or don't understand why most Japanese people do? It could be anything from the levels of politeness, kanji, or how vague Japanese can be. There's a few things. The writing system is obviously pretty fucked up in Japanese, and I'm not saying that I have a good idea for an alternative, but all in all, the writing system is just so convoluted that I don't really think there's any way you can justify it, being that there's multiple different writing systems all combined into one, all the different alphabets, and how it takes so long to learn kanji, and how kanji are used so inconsistently in so many different ways. I think it's hard to really think about whether kanji is even really justified in Chinese, but at least in Chinese, they have consistent readings, and there's only one type of reading. There's not onyomi and kunyomi, and so in Japanese, it's just so convoluted that really, I don't think there's any way to justify it. There has to be a better writing system that it could be possible to come up with. Maybe that's not just hiragana, because obviously you can think of a lot of problems of Japanese. If it was just written with hiragana, obviously that's not a very good idea. But Korean seems to be doing just fine with a purely phonetic writing system, despite previously using a mix of a phonetic system and kanji. And so I imagine that that would be possible in Japanese too, if, Japanese scholars or the government or whatever really went out of their way to work out something that was internally consistent, even though it would probably be difficult to adjust to. But yeah, of course, there's a lot of cool things you can do in the Japanese writing system because of the way it is now. And if you created a simpler, more internally consistent system, you wouldn't be able to do those things. But really, does that extra room for creativity justify how complex and convoluted the writing system is? No, I don't think so, especially because at the end of the day, it's a tool for language is a tool for communication. But other more specific things are I think that recently Japanese people use way too many English words when speaking Japanese, and I don't just hate this because I'm a Japanese purist or anything. But I think that when you replace a Japanese word with an English word, you're degrading the usefulness of the language in a very practical way. Because if you have, most words in most languages are created from basically morphemes, which basically means that there's these small chunks, like roots and stems, right? There's these small chunks of language that have a consistent meaning that are kind of the building blocks of words. And so when you become fluent in a language, you kind of internalize what the meanings of all these small building blocks are. And this allows you to very accurately guess the meaning of new words, and also just retain the meanings of words, even if you had to look them up, right? So it's like bicycle. right? Like to wheel. And so it makes perfect sense, right? And in Japanese, jitensha, which means like self-spinning wheel, or self-spinning self-spinning car, or self-spinning thing with wheels. And so it makes perfect sense, right? Except if you have a English word brought into Japanese, like let's just say like, what's like a Japanese word like baishikuru or whatever, like if they brought in that word, then to Japanese people, it would mean nothing, right? There would be no morphemes it could be broken down to, because that's from a different phonetic system, a different language. And so Japanese people just have to memorize it verbatim. And that becomes very hard to do. And that's why Japanese people actually really struggle with katakana words, is because you can't break them down into smaller components, really, right? And so, like, for example, in Chinese, they almost never just borrow things phonetically from other languages. It happens, but usually they translate the meaning of the word into Chinese morphemes. And that way it becomes a kind of natural sounding, Chinese sounding word that's very easy for Chinese people to remember. For example, the word for like cell phone is like shoji, which means like tape or hand machine. And so hand machine, cell phone, it makes sense, right? And I'm pretty sure that they use that word for smartphones as well. In Japanese, the word for smartphone is sumaho, which is short for smartphone. And so this doesn't mean anything in Japanese, right? You hear, like, obviously smartphone is too long to say, so they have to shorten it down. And then it's just smaho. And if you took a random Japanese person from like 50 years ago and you're like, hey, this is a smaho, like, they would have no idea why the sound sumaho would correspond to this device. It would be a kind of arbitrary association. And so it's just inefficient when the associations between sound and meaning are kind of arbitrary. And so from the Japanese person's point of view, more and more things are becoming arbitrary because there are these long English words and that are just smushed down into a kind of acronym thing. And so as that happens more and more, like, I don't have any issue about the purity of Japanese or whatever, but I just think that the more words in a language that are created out of the same set of morphological building blocks, then the easier that language is going to be to use correctly and to learn and to just, basically function in. And so I think that Japanese is just like really fucking up its own language by bringing in all these words that are completely foreign and don't have any morphological basis. And the other thing is that they're just doing it because they think it sounds cool, is the real reality. And that's a really stupid reason to make your language way, way less functional. And so, yeah, that sucks. And then the other thing that I thought of was that I don't like how in Japanese, dubs of foreign material and in general just voiceovers of like anime and even just in dramas, how they speak in a way that is completely different from how people speak in real life. I just really don't like this because it makes it a lot harder for me to get into the story and relate with the characters, right? Like, if I'm watching an anime and the type of language being used and the type of enunciation that the voice actor is doing is just completely different than how people speak in real life, like not even remotely similar, then it's hard for me to feel like these characters are real people that I can relate to and understand and can get invested in, right? It's hard to kanjo inu, as they say in Japanese, which basically is what I just said. And so I just think that if the way that Japanese was used in fiction was closer to how it was used in real life, then it would just be a lot easier to enjoy fiction and relate to fiction. And so, I mean, I think it's okay for there to be some anime-like crazy stuff, but overall, such a large majority of Japanese fiction seems to use language that only exists in fiction, and I think that's kind of disappointing, especially dubs. Because if you watch a dub of, for example, an American movie in Japanese, they dub the characters as if they're anime characters. And knowing the actual English original, it doesn't kind of recreate the felt sense of the actors at all. It's completely different and super cringy. And so I feel bad for Japanese people that that's what that's all they have if they want to watch a dub, right? They have these super corny anime-like renditions that aren't remotely similar to the original. So that's something that could just easily be changed, right? It's like a fad. It's like someone could just come around and say, hey, I'm gonna, like, let's dub this movie and actually make it sound like how Japanese people talk in real life. And I think that would be great. So hopefully that happens one day. Japan seems to be copying Western style way of doing things more and more. So maybe they'll just catch on, and some Japanese guy will come along and be like, fuck what we've done up until now. Let's just make things realistic. And first it will be really shocking, and then maybe it'll catch on. So that'd be cool. So Z May asks, favorite Japanese insult / cuss word. So I like those like kind of Japanese cuss words. I mean, I don't know about cuss word, like they don't really have that equivalent concept, but in terms of mean insults like that, I like the ones that are just 2 syllables long and feel really good to say, like bus and kas, or like kuzu. Especially like bus, because that just means like ugly. It's normally used to talk about girls. Like, it's like the most meanest thing you could say to a girl is just bus. And it's sometimes you hear that just one word and they just say it like that. They don't say busu, they just say like bus. And it's just really funny and it's fun to say. So I've never heard that in real life, only heard that in fiction, but I think it's pretty funny. And then, just like kono kuzu or like kasu, and those basically just both mean like garbage, you piece of shit. And when you really understand the nuance of what they mean, it's like hits you pretty hard when someone just spits one of those. And then also I thought I like the word joljaku as an insult. Joljaku is short for joho jaksha, which means, well, literally it means like person who is weak regarding information, but it just means people who don't know how to inform themselves on various topics and basically just lose out in life because they're ignorant and uninformed. And it especially refers to people who don't know how to use the internet, like old people and stuff. And I think that's like a pretty interesting concept and a way of insulting someone. Saying that you're information weak. So I thought that was pretty cool. Okay, next question. So Jackson Hardy asks, if you could design a scientific study to attempt to prove some of your theories or to quantify what we know through anecdotal experience, what would that study look like? What areas would you want to focus in on? For the sake of the mental exercise, let's say you have unlimited funding and all the linguistics and scientists you want at your disposal. I mean, I would just have people do MIA in a very controlled setting and then have people do different, more traditional methods in a controlled setting and then see what the results are, basically. But really, if I was going to go into detail on this, I think I would have to do a lot more research into linguistics and what studies have already been done and what has already been shown through scientific studies, and also just how scientific studies work in general and how they're designed and this potential pitfalls and all those type of things. So, I mean, haven't really looked too much into that or put too much thought into that, so I can't really just go into detail off the top of my head, but basically there would have to be a way to objectively quantify how well people can understand a certain language and also how well they can speak a certain language. So we'd have to come up with tests that don't suck to measure people's comprehension and speaking ability in all the various dimensions, like grammatical accuracy, pronunciation, naturalness of expression, and all the other possible dimensions. And then, I mean, first I would want to focus in on what builds comprehension and then what builds output ability. So for what builds comprehension, you could have like one group of people who does MIA, and so probably just for the sake of the scientific, controlled setting, we would have to choose what they're going to immerse with and monitor how many hours they immerse in it. And so you could pick out some drama or whatever and have them watch watch these series of drama, and then there would be one group that just does that, and then another group that does that and learns a deck of sentence cards that are based off of that drama, and then another group that like just does SRS study, and then maybe another group that does like textbook study, or we could have a bunch of groups that have all these different type of things, and then they would just do that for like a couple thousand hours, however long that takes, whether it's like a year or 2 or 3, and then we measure and then there'd have to be a group that also does output regularly, because some people think that output helps you grow your comprehension, and then every combination of one of these things. And so you do that on, I don't know, like 1,000 people on each group. And of course there would be the issue of what if the dramas that you choose to show the people are interesting to some people and not interesting to others, and that plays a big role. Well, you wouldn't be able to take that into account on the first go. First, you just have to choose seemingly neutral dramas and just run the test with that and see what kind of results you get. And then later you could run the same tests with different dramas, and then you could try to isolate the exact effects of how interesting the content is to the person. But if it was a scientific experiment, you can only isolate one variable at a time. So first it would just be like immersion versus immersion and SRS versus just SRS versus like SRS and textbook study, and versus like immersion and speak and like interaction with a native speaker that involves output, and however many possibilities that would be. You would try that all, and you'd have them all do it for a certain number of hours total, and then you'd measure the results and you'd see which one was better. And then you could do a whole nother thing for output ability and see like do basically the same thing, but measure like, okay, when people start outputting at this point in the process after doing this, then they get this result after this amount of time. And you just kind of like go and try every single possibility. And I mean, not every single possibility, but all the main different ones you could conceive of, like the main different types of like, okay, output from the beginning, and also you get immersion from the beginning, and like output from the beginning, and you do immersion and you do the SRS, or like immersion and SRS for like 500 hours, and then you start outputting, and you just kind of test all these different things. I mean, you could probably think of a smart order to do it so that you could reduce the number of studies that you would have to do to collect the type of information we're looking for, right? Like you would start with like the big different categories, and then slowly hone in on subtle differences. But I think if you did that, you could hone into like what things make a difference and what doesn't. And so you could probably find that, for example, outputting doesn't affect comprehension at all. Like you can, whether or not you're practicing speaking or not, that doesn't affect the speed at which your comprehension ability grows. You could probably easily learn that. You could probably also learn that if you don't have a lot of immersion, no matter what you do, doesn't do anything. And then you could probably also learn that if immersion combined with certain types of study leads to faster growth and comprehension than just immersion. And we could probably learn that on the output spectrum that, output, but time spent outputting before a certain number of hours of input has been reached doesn't affect the final result at all, and in fact probably would lead to worse pronunciation in the long term and more grammatical mistakes in the long term. I would say we could probably eventually have pretty good evidence for all of these things. Again, I can't go too further into detail than that on the actual study design, because I would have to study how those type of things work more. But I mean, if we actually were able to pay people to participate in this study for like 2,000 hours, right, of like to come into a booth for 10 hours a day every day, or like 6 days a week for 2 years, if we had enough money to do that, then I think it wouldn't be that hard to kind of really hone in on what works and what doesn't when it comes to language learning. So Tino Jehudi asks, would you still recommend, as Katsumoto did, starting to learn another language at some point in MIA? Katsumoto was almost always saying it was part of AJAT, if I remember well. When would you recommend to do that? I'm planning to learn Spanish, which is an easy language for me as compared to Japanese. So I don't really know what you're talking about here. Would you still recommend learning another language? I don't remember ever explicitly recommending that people pick up a third language. So I don't know what you're talking about there. Katsumoto was almost saying it was part of AJAT. No, I don't really think so. Like, you got to remember that AJAT was just a blog that Katsumoto would just talk about his experiences, and Katsumoto wanted to be a polyglot. He said he didn't, but he really did. He always, maybe, okay, I take that back. Maybe I wouldn't say he wanted to be a polyglot, but Katsumoto wanted to learn Chinese from the start. And he continually tried to learn Chinese with traditional methods and continued to fail. Then, in order to kind of get a fresh start and get away from all of his failures learning Chinese, he decided to learn a different language and test out completely new, radical methods in the new language, and that was Japanese. And so he did Japanese using his new method, which was mostly just anti-moon, but executed really hardcore. And then it worked. And so, of course, he was like, okay, cool. Now I'm going to go learn Chinese, because that was what I really wanted to do the entire time, right? He wanted to learn Chinese the entire time. So it wasn't like his goal was to learn two languages. His goal was to learn Chinese, and then he ended up learning Japanese to do this experiment, and then he always went back to learn Chinese. And then he ended up learning Mandarin and Cantonese, because in the middle of learning Mandarin, he realized that he thought Cantonese was really cool, and he just found himself really attracted to that language, so he ended up learning Cantonese as well. And so it wasn't like he had this plan where he was like, okay, I'm going to make a method, and the method's to learn 2 to 3 languages. It wasn't like that at all. The method was to learn one language. He just happened to want to know multiple languages. And because a lot of language learners tend to want to learn multiple languages for whatever reason, I mean, I can understand why, but it seems like most people who learn a language to fluency, like literally more than half, they start learning another language after, just because I guess they enjoyed the process. They miss how fun it was to be a beginner/intermediate learner. Learning one language makes them curious about how different other languages are. And just the general process of discovery of learning a language is very rewarding. So naturally, a lot of people want to learn multiple languages. And so Katsumoto did give advice on how to approach learning multiple languages, because himself and many of the readers of the blog were interested in that. But I wouldn't say it was part of the method. And really, I don't really even say there was an AJAT method, because really Katsumoto was just talking about advice, right? He wasn't really saying, here is the method. He's just saying, hey, here's a rough outline of what I did. Maybe you could try it too. And then he would just talk about little tips and tricks, mostly. And if you actually read the outline on the AJAT website, it doesn't have language 1, language 2 on it. It's just for one language, and it goes from start to fluency, and that's it. So, I mean, you got to really think, like, what do you mean when you say the AJAT method? Because, I mean, we all know what it means. It's like the general outline that Katsumoto gave, and also combined with all the tips and tricks that he gave. But really, he was just throwing out ideas, and he says that in the website. And so, really, if we were going to classify what the AJAT method is based on the website, I don't think learning multiple languages would be included in that. It's just, if you do want to learn multiple languages, then maybe learn your third one using your second one as an anchor, and that way you'll have an easy time maintaining your L2 while you learn your L3. And so I would say the same thing. I think that's good advice, depending on what your target language is. Because actually, this is where I think my opinion would differ from Katsumoto's, because Katsumoto would say, if your L2 was Japanese and your L3 was Spanish, use Japanese to learn Spanish. But I honestly think that's really stupid advice, because learning Spanish in Japanese is going to be way harder than learning Spanish in English, just because Spanish is so similar to English. And so the way that concepts are going to be explained in a Spanish textbook written in English, are going to be much more intuitive and make much more sense than one written for Japanese people, because Japanese people have to really twist their mind in a really indirect way to kind of get how Spanish is going to work, whereas for English speakers, it's going to be quite intuitive and natural. And there's also just going to be a lot of I mean, I can go more into detail in that, but basically I think If you're learning a third language, learn that third language in whatever language is closest to the language that you know, basically. So it's like for me, when I'm learning Chinese, I mostly learn Chinese in Japanese because Japanese is way closer to Chinese than English is. And so for me, the Japanese explanations of Chinese grammar and vocabulary make much more sense, and they're much closer and accurate than the English ones. And so it makes sense. But if I was learning Spanish, I wouldn't do it in Japanese just because Japanese is my L2, right? I would do it in English. So I'd say that advice about laddering, I would say it only really applies if your L3 is closer to your L2 than your L1. And then would I recommend, just in general, would I recommend people to learn a third language? I mean, well, not in a vacuum. I would only recommend learning a third language if you want to learn a third language, right? Like, I have no recommended goals for people, right? There's so many different goals you can have in language learning, right? You can learn one language to a kind of intermediate level. You can learn one language to a very high level. You can learn a bunch of languages to an intermediate level. You can learn one language to a high level and then also learn a bunch of other languages to an intermediate level. You can try to learn multiple languages to a very high level, although that's going to take probably multiple decades to accomplish. And so it's not that one of these goals is better than another one. It completely depends on what your goals are. And so I think any of those are completely valid. And so if you really want to, if you finish learning a language and you just want to repeat the process because it was enjoyable for you, then go for it. If you finish learning a language and then there's another language that you actually want to know just because you have a special connection to that language or there's something you want to do with that language, then go ahead and learn that language. So, but I wouldn't just say like blank life advice separate from whatever specific to the person. Like, yes, it is a good thing to learn multiple languages. And in fact, if we're really talking in a vacuum, I would lean towards the opposite side. And I've talked about this before because I think that when you learn your first foreign language to a high level, you benefit in two ways. First of all, you become able to speak and understand a foreign language. Second of all, you learn a lot about yourself, about how different cultures are, how different languages can be, about staying committed to a single project for long periods of time, and a lot of just things about determination and about the different process, the different stages in that you go through when you achieve mastery. And so you basically learn all these meta skills related to life, the world, yourself, and growing. And so you really get those two benefits. And I actually think that the meta skill benefits, the second one, is actually more valuable in most cases. And so you get both of those when you learn a second language. When you learn a third language, you already gained most of the meta skill benefits from learning your second language, and so there's not much more left to be gained in that category. There's a little bit more perhaps, but you already have probably 90% of the life skill benefits from that you can get from learning a language after learning your first foreign language. And so when you start learning your third language, you pretty much just get the language benefits of knowing another foreign language, and you don't really get the life skill benefits because you already got them, right? You're basically just doing the same thing that you already did once over again, right? Like, imagine that you had a video game and you beat the video game 2 times in a row, right? The first time it's going to be a lot more challenging and it's going to cause you to grow your skills a lot more and to learn a lot more than the second time, because the second time you already know exactly what to do, right? And of course you might get better on the second round and you'll learn even more and you'll get even faster, you'll still grow. But the amount that you'll grow from going from having never played the game to beating the game the first time is way, 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 way more than when you go from having beat the game once to having beat the game twice. And then, of course, when you go from twice to 3 times, it shrinks even more, like shrinks exponentially. There's diminishing returns. And so I would say, because there's so much different stuff out there, so many different skills out there that you can acquire, so many different topics you can learn about, that from my point of view, it kind of seems mottainai, as they would say in Japanese. It seems like almost a little bit wasteful to learn 2 languages to a high level when you could learn one language to a high level and then learn some completely other skill. It's going to grow you in some other way and make you a much more well-rounded person with a much wider range of experience and knowledge. But again, that's just in a vacuum. I think there's a lot of good reasons to want to learn multiple languages. And if you have a good reason, then go for it. But I would just say, think deeply before you go down the path of doing nothing but languages for the rest of your life, because I'm not so sure if that's really going to give you the best bang for your buck when it comes to being a human in the 21st century. And then I guess the last part of your question, when would I recommend doing it? I would recommend starting your third language when you're as good as you want to be at your second language, right? So like I said, there's all different types of goals. Some people want to get to an intermediate level in a bunch of languages. Some people want to get to a high level in one language and an intermediate level in another language. And so let's say your L2 is Japanese, right? Decide how good you want to be at Japanese and then get that good before you move on to learning your L3, which you say is going to be Spanish. And I say this because once you start juggling multiple languages, improving gets much harder. And so overall, you're just going to save yourself a lot of headache if you just get as good as you want to be at your L2 when that's all you have to worry about before you go on to your L3, because then you only have one thing to worry about at a time. I mean, you're still going to have to do a lot of work to maintain your L2 once you start your L3, but trying to get better at your L2 while trying to get better at your L3 is just going to be a headache. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's going to take up a huge amount of time, and it's going to be very stressful and frustrating, and I just don't see any point to it. I really think the only reason someone would do that is because of impatience, and I think that's a bad reason to put yourself in that situation. So I would say, however good you want to be at your L2, get that good, and then move on. And if you only want to be at a intermediate level at your L2, that's totally fine. It's all relative to your goals. So Renfred Harper asks, do you think it would be a good idea to mark progress through each stage of the MIA stages on the timeline with roughly the number of immersion hours expected to reach that stage, instead of the number of cards? Right now it says 3.5k cards for stage 2, 7k cards for stage 3, etc., which makes it feel a bit like SRS is the primary goal. Making immersion hours the primary measure might help people prioritize correctly and realize they won't progress with only 1 hour a day. How many hours in your experience do you think it took you to get to each stage? So I think you have a really good point here. I definitely agree with you that by putting numbers next to how many cards you need to make, but not numbers next to how many hours of immersion you need to have, people definitely start thinking of the timeline in terms of the SRS over immersion. They definitely start to put way too much emphasis on immersion. And I've gotten a lot of questions of like, hey, I just learned about MIA and I'm just starting MIA, but I'm actually already at an intermediate level, but I never used Anki. So do I still have to make all these cards even though that I'm basically already at stage 3 and I have 0 cards? And it's like, no. The number of cards don't really mean anything. It's just like a rough guideline if you actually started at the beginning of MIA. It really doesn't mean anything. Yet, because that's the only kind of numerical value listed on the timeline, people definitely put way too much emphasis on it. And so ideally, yeah, I would have estimates for the number of hours of immersion, but really, I don't have any good, accurate way of measuring what those numbers are going to be. And because, I mean, if I don't remember exactly how long it took me to get to each stage, I have a rough guess. And I don't know exactly how many hours of immersion I was doing. I only have a rough guess. So I feel like if I put numbers there, then that would it has the potential to just be so far off that it could be more harmful than productive. And the other thing is that the number of hours is going to be totally different depending on what your target language is, right? Like if you're an English speaker and you're learning Spanish, the number of hours that you're going to have to put in immersing for each stage is going to be a fraction of the total number of hours you need to put in if you're learning Japanese as a native English speaker. And so I think in the future, as more people do MIA and more people accurately record how much immersion they do, I think hopefully we'll be able to start getting these stats and actually have a kind of idea of there would be some kind of chart that shows like, okay, if you're learning, like maybe there'd be like 3 levels of languages where it's like, If the language is in the same language family as your native language, then it's going to take this many hours of immersion per stage. If the language that you're learning is like in a different language family than you're learning and has like these challenges, then it's going to be this many hours. And if it's like this, and if it's at a different language family and it's one of these super hard languages that are inherently hard for a bunch of reasons, then it's going to be, sorry, my hair's like bothering me. I just got out of the shower. Then it's going to be this many hours. So basically it would have to be relative. Basically, yeah. So I have the idea of making 3 kind of categories that kind of tell you how many hours you're going to need based off of what your native language is, or based off the languages you know and your target language. But that's going to be a very difficult thing to do, and I'm going to need a lot more data than I have now. And so at this point, I mean, yeah, ideally there would be numbers, but I don't have the ability to come up with what those numbers are going to be in any accurate sense, really, so at the present moment. So, I mean, maybe I could still try to come up with something. I mean, I would have to sit down and really think about it for a few hours. So, I mean, I can't give you numbers right here in the stream of consciousness Q&A, but maybe perhaps in the near future I'll sit down and try to come up with at least an estimate, at least for if you're learning Japanese and you only speak a European language or something. And I can talk to Yoga, compare that with his experience, and maybe we could try to get some estimates going. Perhaps that is a good idea. So I guess I'll think about that more in the near future. So does your 3 to 5 hour minimum time spent on immersion apply to any L2, or is that more Japanese specific? If a native English speaker were doing MIA to learn Spanish, do you think they could see significant gains only being able to commit 2 to 3 hours per day, assuming they split the time into thirds like you recommend, 1/3 Anki, 1/3 reading, 1/3 listening? So yeah, I mean, I kind of just coincidentally just said this in the previous question. But yeah, how many hours you need to immerse each day to make swift progress is going to totally depend on how different your target language is than your native language or the languages that you're already fluent in. And so if you're an English speaker learning Spanish, I would say you probably could make a lot of progress on one solid hour of immersion per day plus SRS. So yeah, you said like 2 to 3 hours total. So yeah, if you had 2 to 3 hours total, and let's say you had like 1 hour SRS, 1 hour reading, 1 hour watching, I'd say you could make lots of progress. Probably, I would say that, I mean, and again, I haven't learned Spanish or learned an easy language, but talking to Yoga, who learned Portuguese and who has dabbled in German and stuff, it kind of sounds like Japanese is 3 times as hard as Spanish or Portuguese or other languages very close to English. So maybe 3 hours a day is like the equivalent of 9 hours a day of Japanese, right? Maybe you'd have to do 9 hours a day of Japanese to get the equivalent of 3 hours a day of Spanish. That's probably exaggerated, maybe more like 6. Maybe it's like half. And again, these are just giant estimates, just total speculation. I don't have any actual numbers on this. I haven't actually learned Spanish, but I would say that based on all the things that I've heard and my current understanding, that yeah, probably you could get away with doing half the time and as a Japanese learner and still make just as much progress. So Brian Volter asks, if you had all day free to study your L2, what would your ideal schedule be? I.e., how would you break up the time into reading, listening, SRS, output, if you were at that point, etc.? Would there be any passive listening? Maybe you can do 2 versions, one for infinite willpower / tolerance of menial tasks, and one for average human willpower. So I would have really preferred if you specified what stage in the process you are in, because how I would spend my time would be completely different depending on what stage in the process I was in. And I'm not going to go through every single stage in the process because that would be like over half an hour just talking about that one question. But I'll answer your question assuming that I'm past the beginner stage, because you have to do certain things as a beginner that you don't have to do once you're not a beginner, and that I'm not yet to the output stage, because there's certain things that you do that you have, not that you have to do, but that ideally you would do if you're focusing on output that you wouldn't do if you're not. So I'd say that the bulk of the language acquisition process takes place between after you get out of stage 1 and you're not a beginner anymore, and before you start outputting. So I'll talk about that chunk of time, what I would do each day if I had literally all day to learn a language and I was already not a beginner anymore. So I would probably wake up, and as soon as I woke up, I would sleep in silence, because I think quality of sleep is extremely important, and I don't want to risk the quality of sleep by playing stuff in the background that I'm probably not going to really be hearing anyway. So I would sleep in silence, and then I would wake up at 7 o'clock maybe. Doesn't really matter what time I wake up. And then as soon as I woke up, or maybe I'd set up an alarm clock where as my alarm clock rang, then audio would start playing in my room. Like, I'd have a speaker set up with a timer, and then so as my alarm rang, my target language audio would just start playing in my room, and this audio would be taken from something I'd watched in the language. I'd probably mostly watch dramas, live action dramas, and so probably realistic fiction action dramas for the bulk of the time. And so I would probably have the ripped audio from a drama that I'd already seen. That would start automatically. I'd go and take a shower then, and I would use a shower speaker. I'd continue to listen to the same type of background audio that was playing in my room, ripped audio from something that I'd actively watched before. Then, I'd come back into my room and get dressed and stuff. And again, that audio would still be playing in my room while I was getting dressed. And then I would turn it off, and I'd probably meditate for like an hour and a half, and I would meditate in silence. And after that, then I would probably start time boxing, doing reps, and reading. So I'd probably read for 20 minutes, and then do 10 minutes of reviews on Anki. And I'd be mixing in new cards as I reviewed. I'd have new cards and reviews mixed together. And so then I'd probably do 20 minutes of reading, 10 minutes of reps. And I just do that over and over until I eat breakfast. I mean, I normally don't eat breakfast. I normally do intermittent fasting. And so I would do that basically until lunchtime. And so probably by the time lunch would come around, I'd probably have already read, let's see, let's say that if I'm starting at 9 o'clock, and then let's say I ate at 1 o'clock, so it'd be 9, 10, 11, 12, 1. That's 4 hours, and so that would probably be a little bit of more than 2 hours of reading. And so yeah, then during lunch, I would probably be passively listening to the same stuff again, or maybe I'd listen to a podcast or something, because you can pay more attention when you're cooking and eating. So maybe I'd listen to a podcast or something in my target language, and I'd eat lunch, and then maybe I'd go for a walk after lunch and continue listening. And then I would come back and I'd start reading and repping again. And I'd do that for a few more hours, the same time boxing schedule. And then I would switch to, and then I'd do that until I basically finished my reps. And then maybe it would be 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then I would switch to watching and making cards. So I'd do time boxing, actively watching for 20 minutes, and then card making for 10 minutes. And I do that repeatedly until maybe 6 o'clock. And then I would eat dinner, and then I would just resume doing what I was doing before of watching and making cards. And then if I got tired, I would stop making cards. I'd just watch, and then maybe I'd watch a movie. And I would probably be mostly reading. Well, I'd probably alternate between reading novels and reading nonfiction books. And I try to watch a variety of things. At the beginning, I'd focus mostly, like I said, on live action drama. But as I got better, I would spread out and try to watch documentaries and academic lectures and comedy and all sorts of different stuff. Try to build up my listening abilities, as broadly as possible. And then I would go to bed and do it all again. And maybe I'd try to fit in, exercise somewhere in there. At some point, maybe, between lunch and dinner, I would go jogging for 30 minutes or something. I'd passively listen then too. So yeah, it'd probably be something like that. I would time box if I literally had all day, I would just time box the SRS card making and reviewing, because you're going to be able to get in way more without getting tired. But if I was a normal person with a schedule, like most people are, like if I was a normal person who only had a portion of their day to dedicate to language learning, not literally all day, then I would probably choose to do all my SRS reviews in the morning and then all my card making at once in the evening. But if I literally had all day and I didn't have anything else to do, that's probably how I would do it, because it would allow me to do the total largest amount of SRSing possible. And I wouldn't need a super willpower version and an average person version. I could do that easy. That sounds great. That'd be fun. I'd get better so fast at whatever my target language was. It would probably be a blast. It'd be crazy. You get better so quickly that you just be blowing your own mind constantly at how much better you are than like 4 days ago. And so that would totally keep me going. Like, I wouldn't need any willpower to do that. That sounds blissful to me. So I don't know how much willpower the average person has, so I can't really like make a schedule for the average person's willpower, but I don't know. I mean, I don't really believe in willpower in the traditional sense. That's a whole other story though. And so I can only really speak to myself, but I love language learning. And so that doesn't require, all the things I talked about don't require any willpower. That sounds blissful. So yeah. Alex Rogers asks, "Hi Matt, I have a question regarding a metaskill. How would you recommend to go about practicing structuring and presenting your thoughts/arguments when speaking? I often find myself in situations where I want to express my ideas about something, but I can't come up with a good way to explain what I want to say soon enough. Which of course is extremely impractical when talking to people in real time. I often have a problem where my mind goes completely blank when I'm trying to express my opinion about something, sometimes even about simple everyday things. I suppose it's the idea of having to say it right then and there, and having no time to think that's causing me to freeze. No matter which language. My introverted personality certainly contributes to this as well, since I can go for long periods of time without really talking much to people. How do you think I could go about fixing that? Do you think it's a matter of having things prepared, or just sheer hours of practice? Have you ever practiced this skill specifically / faced a similar problem? Any help would be greatly appreciated." So I think that there's an easy solution to this, and that's practice makes perfect, right? If you want to get better at speaking off the cuff and being able to formulate your ideas and your arguments without having rehearsed ahead of time, then you got to practice doing that. And as for specific advice, I would recommend that you start a YouTube channel and that you record long format videos of you speaking on various topics unprepared, and just continue to do that, and you'll get better over time. I think, you talked about, or you asked, do you think it has to do with being prepared? I mean, I think to a certain degree, because in reality, most things that you're going to be talking about on a daily basis, you've talked about before. Like for me, when I'm talking about language learning concepts, I've explained all of these concepts tens of times. And so I already have kind of preset ways in my head that I go about explaining certain ideas. I already have go-to analogies and metaphors that I use and examples and things like that. And so it's pretty easy for me to explain certain language learning topics because I've already done that a bunch of times. And even if, for example, I'm telling a story that happened to me last week, then probably I'll end up telling that story to a few people in my life, right? Maybe I'll tell it to some of my friends, and then I'll tell it to my dad, and then I'll tell it to my brother, and then maybe I'll tell it in like on camera while I'm making a video. And so also every time you tell a story, you get better at telling the story. And also I think that, at least for me, if a lot of times when I'm just in the shower or, taking a walk, I'm kind of, and I don't do it on purpose, but I'm kind of just passively planning about what I'm going to say to certain people. Like sometimes if I know I'm going to talk to my mom later, I'll just be thinking about, what do I want to tell my mom about? And then I'll think about a few things, and then I'll think about, well, how am I going to articulate those things? How am I going to present those things? How am I going to explain them? And like, for example, before filming this Q&A, I read all the questions, and then I went and took a shower, and then here I am filming. And so when I was in the shower, I was kind of thinking roughly what kind of stuff do I want to say, how do I want to approach some of these questions, and I could have practiced way more. And so of course here I am. You can see I'm not the most articulate right now, but I'm definitely doing a lot better. I know I'm doing a lot better than I would be if I was reading these questions for the first time and answering them with literally zero preparation. And so I think, preparation plays a certain role, and I think you kind of just get into the habit of, just thinking about how you're going to express certain ideas. And so if you literally never do that, if like whenever you're living your life, you never think about conversations that you're going to have with other people, then it kind of makes sense to me that you would really struggle to do that. Because now that I think about it, I have always done that all the time, and I suspect that most social people do that. But of course, there is another component of just being good at, being able to speak off the cuff and thinking in real time. And that, again, is something you can practice. And so I think that all in all, the perfect solution is to, like I said, start a YouTube channel and just film videos on random topics. And you can choose the topic like ahead of time, but don't actually do any real preparation. Like, don't actually write down a script or like do research. Just say like for example, you could just talk about the last movie that you watched, or a certain YouTube video that you watched, or an experience you had as a kid, or your opinion on a certain topic, or your experience learning languages. There's a million different things you could talk about. And so choose a topic and then just speak off the cuff and keep going no matter how bad it is. That's really key. Because if you allow yourself to just stop when it goes badly, well, then you're not practicing the real crucial skill. Because in real life, when you're in the middle of a conversation, you can't just stop the recording and say, oh, fuck it, I need to redo it, right? That's what you're talking about, right? Sometimes you just blank out and you're like, oh, fuck, what do I do? And so you need to practice that as well. You got to practice somehow just keeping on talking, just keep on going somehow, even though you're completely lost and you don't know what to do. And that is a skill you can get better at. And I know what you mean with that. Sometimes your mind just goes blank, because that happens to me while I'm filming things. But that happens to me because part of my mind knows that it's okay to go blank while I'm filming, because I can just start it again and then edit that part out. But it doesn't happen to me when I'm speaking to people in real life, because my mind knows there's no pause button, there's no reset button. And so when I'm speaking to someone in real life, shit will just come out of my mouth. And sometimes I have no idea what I'm going to say, but my mind just knows, like, this is a social situation. You have to act normal. Like, if you just stop talking now, you'll look fucking weird as shit. And so stuff will just come out of my mouth. And that I can't really remember a time when I used to struggle with this. I mean, actually, I think I used to struggle with it more a few years back when I was like, when I just cared about what people thought of me more. Because, there's that kind of counterintuitive thing where the more that you care about what people think of you, then the more self-conscious you get, and then the harder it is to act normal, and then the more awkward you become. And so I used to have more of that when I was younger, but once I started, meditating and doing psychedelics, and just once I kind of became an adult more, I kind of realized that I didn't really give a fuck what random people on the street talk to me, or random people that I don't know that well think of me. And so that actually made it easier to just be natural and to just say whatever. And so if I'm like taking an Uber and I'm forced to have a conversation with some random stranger that I have nothing in common with, my brain's pretty good at just pulling out some bullshit, like coming up with some response to whatever they said that's seemingly thoughtful, and, throwing together some random YouTube video I watched with some random article that I read with just some random bullshit, or asking questions. And so it's really not that hard to do. You just have to kind of figure out how to do it. And so I would say, practice makes perfect. So, just force yourself to actually do this. The reason why I think it's good to put it up on YouTube is because if you know that other people are going to see it, that's going to give you real motivation to perform. It's going to make it closer to real life, right? If you're just keeping them on your computer and no one's ever going to watch them, then you might get really good at doing that, but then you still, in an actual real life situation, that skill might not carry over as well. And so that's why I think you should just put them on YouTube. And of course, no one will watch your YouTube videos anyway, right? Your videos will probably have like less than 10 views most of the time, because that's what happens when you randomly make a YouTube channel and you're just talking about random shit that no one is interested in. But I think it'll still be good. And some people will watch your videos, and every once in a while someone will comment. And if you title your videos, then one time your video will get sucked into the algorithm and a lot of people will actually watch it and you'll get feedback. And so I think it'll be a good experience. And I never deliberately practiced trying to get better at speaking, but I know that having a YouTube channel and making videos like this, talking and watching the videos back and, you know, retaking things multiple times, like I know the process of making YouTube videos, I think, did make me better at just speaking and being able to speak, and especially like being able to talk in front of a crowd without being nervous and stuff like that. So I didn't practice it deliberately, but the practice kind of just happened as a result of me having a YouTube channel. So I think you could get the same benefits by doing what I'm doing in a way, except just for the purpose of getting better at speaking. And I also think that it's just a fun thing to do as well. And really, this is something that I've thought about, how in life, being able to articulate well and, you know, really just express your thoughts and feelings is a really important skill that's going to greatly determine the quality of your life, because you're going to have a lot. If you can't get other people to empathize with you and see your point of view, then you're going to have a really difficult time getting your way. And if you can do that, then you're going to have an easy time getting your way. And so it's a really important skill, but it's not something that just happens naturally. Like, I think a lot of people have this idea where it's like, oh, some people are tall, some people are short. Some people are good at talking, some people are bad at talking, and I'm bad at talking. But that's really not it. It's a skill that gets better with practice, just like any other skill, basically, except most people never practice it. And the people who are good just because they happen to be social people who happen to talk a lot and probably happen to pay a little bit more attention, consciously or subconsciously, to their own speech habits and other people's speech habits. But if you actually practice deliberately, like filming videos and watching the videos back and looking where you have room to improve and things like that, then you're going to get better really quickly. And I think that's a really valuable thing. And so that's why I think whether it's a foreign language or your native language, it's a good thing to actually deliberately practice speaking off the cuff. And I actually have been thinking that I want to do it more, because I mean, I do get a lot of practice making YouTube videos, but I could do it even more. And I especially want to practice talking about, like you have been talking about, like things that, trying to just talk about a subject that I know nothing about and being more articulate. And I actually feel that I'm still pretty bad at talking. I mean, obviously you thought that I was good enough at talking to ask me how to get better at talking, right? Because if you thought I totally sucked at talking, you probably wouldn't have asked me this question. But every time I watch back my videos, I cringe because I make a lot of grammatical errors when I'm speaking. And I don't know if this is because I just need to practice more, or if learning Japanese actually fucked up my head and now I can't speak English grammatically. I know whenever I make a mistake, like when I watch the video back, I'm like, what the fuck? Why did I not add an S there? But when I'm speaking, it just happens. So I definitely want to get better at that. I want to get better at just speaking more smoothly and not having to restart sentences constantly or use fillers constantly, and just have a more consistent, smooth flow. And also just, in general, be better with words and be able to describe things better. So I still think I have tons of room for improvement, and I'm planning on doing the same. I'm planning on maybe just making a YouTube video and not telling it, a new YouTube channel where I talk about random crap, and maybe not telling anyone about it, or maybe I'll put it on my second channel that a few people know about. But yeah, and I want to do it in Japanese and English, because I think that I have a ton of room to improve, and I think that's definitely a worthwhile thing to train, because it's going to benefit you in all your life. So yeah, I hope that was useful. So Mikuru asks, "Hey Matt, do you feel it's better to consume media from one source at a time? I've been watching anime a long time and tend to watch a lot of seasonal anime week to week, but I've been wondering if this approach would be diversifying my immersion, giving me more. If this approach would be diversifying my immersion, giving me more, or if going from a slice to life to cop drama to romance to a battle shonen could be making it harder for myself to pick up what's been said compared to learning from a single binge series at a time. You should learn how to use commas and periods better. And no offense. But, I mean, I don't really think it matters that much, to be honest. Like, I think it's going to be negligible in the long term. And that's the good thing about the SRS, is that if you're putting words in the SRS, you're going to learn them pretty well. So you're not only relying on immersion. I would say that if you weren't using the SRS and you were only relying on immersion, then you probably would want to focus on one genre at a time, because, you know, if you're only watching 20 minutes of cop anime a week, then that might not be enough to acquire all the cop vocabulary. And so you might have to watch like nothing but cop stuff for a month to really acquire all the vocabulary. But if you're using an SRS and you make cards for the cop vocabulary, then you can learn the cop vocabulary in 20 minutes a week, no problem. So I'd say that's the beauty of the SRS, is it really holds all your mental dictionary entries in place for you so that you can hop around quite a bit, and I don't really think it's going to slow anything down. And overall, following your interests is extremely important for the quality of your immersion. And so I'd say if hopping around and watching multiple series at once allows you to be more engaged and enjoy yourself more and pay better attention, then you should probably do that. And that's probably going to lead to the best results in the long term. So, yeah, I think it's totally fine. I wouldn't worry about it. Monzi asks, as far as I know, you've never practiced writing sentences by hand and from memory, only isolated kanji when you did traditional RTK. But can you? I also did traditional RTK, and even though I can write isolated kanji with no problem, when writing a text or sentences by hand, I often can't recall which kanji are associated with words I already know, with listening and reading wise. I'm thinking about writing sentences by hand while doing my reps to practice that, but I want to confirm if it's actually necessary. So I have practiced writing sentences by hand, but even before I started practicing that, I was pretty good at it. Like, I would say you're saying that sometimes you have trouble remembering what kanji are used in words that you already know. But my question is, are you fluent in reading Japanese? Like, really fluent? Like, where you can just take a random novel off the shelf at the bookstore and read it as if it was your native language? Because if you're not at that point, then getting better at reading is going to automatically make you better at writing kanji as well, assuming that you have done traditional RTK and you actually have maintained traditional RTK. Like, you can still maintain a high retention rate on your traditional RTK reps. And so what my experience was that I got really, really good at reading, to the point where reading Japanese did feel like similar to reading English. And then I did traditional RTK, and then for the most part, I could write no problem. Now, there were some things here and there where I would just blank out. And even sometimes common words, like, I would just be like, wait, that's a super common word, but is it that kanji or that kanji? Or just like, oh, fuck, what was that kanji again? So it would happen occasionally. And that was just because, again, it's like, if you want to really be solid at a skill, you got to practice that skill. So if you want to really be solid at writing Japanese sentences from memory, you got to practice that. But when that would happen, I would just try to write sentences out from hand. I would get stumped. I couldn't remember what the kanji was. I'd look it up, and then I'd be like, oh yeah. Then I write it, and then I would never have trouble writing it again. And so within just a few weeks of practicing writing out by hand, I could write no problem at all. And I was just writing for like 10, 20 minutes a day. And so I would say it takes some practice, but very little, given that you are fluent in reading and you have done traditional RTK. And I wouldn't write out your reps, because a lot of times, if you're already relatively advanced, like, well, first of all, if you're doing text cards, then that's totally cheating, because you see the kanji and then you write it out. So that's not equivalent to actually writing it from memory. If you have audio cards, that's another thing. But even if you're doing audio cards, if you're at the stage where you're actually worried about being able to write from memory, that means that you're pretty advanced. And if you're pretty advanced, then most of the words you're going to be seeing in the SRS are going to be pretty rare, uncommon words. And you don't have to be able to write rare, uncommon words from memory. Japanese people can't really write most of those from memory, right? If it's a rare, uncommon word, then it's fine to just write it in kana. Japanese people do that. And most of the time when you're writing by hand, you don't use rare, uncommon words, like unless you're trying to write a novel on like with pen and paper, which you're probably not trying to do, right? You probably just want to be able to write normal stuff out by hand like a Japanese person. And so in that case, I wouldn't practice with your reps. I would practice writing the type of things you want to write, right? Like actually just practice that. Like I think starting a diary is good. Like just start every day, like writing in Japanese for 20 minutes about what you did that day or a movie that you've seen recently. And then whenever you come across a word that you don't know how to write or you can't remember how to write, then just look it up on the spot. And if you do that, you'll get very good at writing very quickly. Again, given that you're already fluent in reading and have done traditional RTK. And so that would be my recommendation. And I have done that in the past and it worked really well. I don't recommend writing out your reps. It's going to be super tedious. It's going to make repping suck super badly. And it's, in my opinion, not the most efficient way to actually get good at writing because your reps aren't going to reflect the type of things that you're going to want to be writing, right? Your reps are about growing your comprehension, not your output. So practice how you play. Like if you want to get good at writing, practice writing what you actually want to be able to write. John Brendel asks, what's up with the YogaMatt podcast? It's been a while since the last episode came out. We've just been busy. I mean, actually, we had a really good idea for the next episode of the YogaMatt podcast. I can't remember what it was, but I think we wrote it down somewhere. But yeah, we just got really busy. And I think when we first started MIA, Yoga and I, Yoga, we were both like, I mean, Yoga, I think, I can't speak on his behalf, but I think he was kind of excited to be now a figure within the community, right? And having an audience to listen to what he had to say. That was a new thing, and it was probably cool and exciting. And this was something that, you know, I think it's cool and exciting too, but I had already had a YouTube channel for over a year, so I was pretty used to having an audience listening to what I had to say. But that was a new thing for Yoga, and so that's why I think he's like, yeah, we should do a podcast. And he was like, yeah, I'm going to make a lot of videos on my channel. And so we started the podcast, and it was cool. And then the thing is, like, once you've been doing YouTube for a few months, and you actually have an audience, the novelty of it kind of wears off, and it kind of, I don't know, it's not as just inherently exciting anymore. And so I think Yoga was kind of like, okay, this is whatever. Like, yeah, like, having people listen to what I have to say isn't the most amazing thing. And so I think his attention kind of went more towards programming and actually creating tools, and that became more like exciting and interesting than just like talking about language learning to the audience. And the other thing is that I think Yoga and I both feel this. It's like you can only talk about language learning for so long, right? It's like there's only so much to talk about. And like for me, part of me is like kind of like every time I have to talk about language learning again, part of me is kind of like, ugh, this again. Because it's kind of boring to me. It's like I've been doing the same exact thing for like a year and a half, 2 years now, talking about the exact same ideas over and over and over again. And so for me, part of me kind of wants to like move on to start thinking about something new, yet I'm just still having to be thinking about language learning over and over again. But I think I'm cool with it because, you know, I'm helping other people learn languages, you know, I'm providing value to other people, and my experience is being useful to other people. So I think it's all cool. But I think for Yoga, once that novelty wore off and he started to feel that like, okay, I'm kind of bored about just talking about language learning over and over again, it was kind of like, okay, let's actually focus on programming now. That's like feels more productive. I'll just let Matt handle the talking about language learning to the audience. And so I think that's part of why, I mean, we're still planning on it, and we still want to do it, and we also want to film episodes where we get guests, because that does sound fun. But I think it kind of just stopped being a priority because of those reasons. And so I guess that's what happened, but I still I mean, it hasn't gone, it hasn't been canceled. We're still planning on doing it in the future. Just don't know where it'll be, because especially now we're pretty busy with working on all the add-ons we have planned. So Carson asks, how many cards of yours became leeches in Anki? What do you do with your incorrect words that become leeches? So very few cards of mine became leeches. Maybe 1 in 200 of my cards would become a leech, and this was because I made I+1 cards. So, and I only made 10 cards a day. So I wasn't overloading my memory with new words. I was learning words that actually showed up in my immersion environment. I was memorizing sentences that actually came from media I consumed, and I remembered where that sentence came from, what scene it came from, and this makes it very easy to remember words. And so I never really had that many leeches. And then also, as I got better, I would sometimes I wouldn't actually take the sentences from my actual immersion content. I would just mark down new unknown words when I was immersing, and then I just look up a sentence out of a sentence bank later. But also, as you get better, learning new words becomes easier and easier. So by the time I was doing that, my meta ability to learn new words was strong enough where, again, I almost never had leeches. So I would have very, very few leeches. And what I would mostly just keep leeches suspended for a while, and then once maybe after a few months had passed, I'd go back and unsuspend some of my old leeches, because I figured I've gotten better, maybe I'll be able to learn them now. But the other thing too is that I never messed with the Anki settings that much when I was in my learning period, because no one told me about how much of a difference that makes, so I didn't know anything about that. So I had super inefficient Anki settings, and so my default leech threshold was 8, my leech threshold was 8, which is the default. So that's super high. So now, come to think of it, I might have had more leeches if I had a leech threshold of like 4 or 5, like I recommend you guys to set. So there is that. So perhaps maybe I would have had more leeches, but it's hard to say. But I would say if you're getting leeches left and right, then you're probably doing something wrong, whether that's your interval modifier is too big or you're not learning the right type of sentences. But some leeches are fine. Like maybe if 1 out of like 30 cards becomes a leech, then I think that's fine. And probably just delete them. Is what I would recommend. So Louis DeBrat asks, hi Matt, what do you think of the idea of creating an output deck, assuming comprehension already isn't a problem, obviously, where you add in sentence patterns that you find while immersing that seem like they would come in handy? I find that Japanese is so specific that, beyond super basic patterns, the probability of encountering the same structure twice in a short enough amount of time for me to acquire is sometimes low. I'm thinking about making the process faster. No, definitely don't recommend doing that. That's not really how output works. Output, like, when you're really ready to output, it pops into your mind at the perfect second from somewhere very deep within your head. And if you haven't experienced this, you're not going to know what I'm talking about. If you have experienced this, you will know what I'm talking about. But when you're truly ready to output, you'll be in a certain situation and your brain will just be like, oh, say this. And then you'll just know intuitively, oh, this is the perfect thing to say at this exact moment. Thanks, brain. And you can't force this process to happen. And the thing is, once you start having these experiences, you start to really realize how powerful your unconscious mind is. Because sometimes for me, I will be in a certain situation and my mind will just throw me something like in this manner. I'm just like, oh, here, say this. And I'll realize that was something that I had only heard once or twice a super long time ago, like maybe over a year ago. And I'm like, whoa, how do I still remember that? Yet I remember it, and then I'm able to use it. And so sounds like you're kind of underestimating the power of your mind to acquire things, because like just the other day, I was watching this English YouTube video where they were, it was on the channel Genius, and it was this segment they have where they have beat producers break down how they made famous rap beats. And so they had this guy, he was talking about how he made some beat for Post Malone, I think it was. And he used the word cooking to mean making beats. And he was like, yeah, I was studying for finals and I took a break and I was just going to cook up some tracks because I always cook whenever I want to just relax. And of course, I immediately recognized, oh, he's using cook to mean make beats, right? It was obvious, easy to infer. And then I remembered right at that moment, like, oh yeah, that reminds me of Breaking Bad, because in Breaking Bad, they used the word cook to mean make meth. And I hadn't seen Breaking Bad in like 4 years. And I hadn't like heard that, like I hadn't even thought about Breaking Bad in like 4 years. And so I was like, wow, it's crazy that my brain remembered that instantaneously. It was just like, oh, cook, using metaphorically, here's another example of that. And I made the connection in my head. And so that was another moment of, I mean, I've had countless of moments like this throughout my life, but in that moment I was like, wow, the unconscious mind is so powerful. It can draw connections throughout time and throughout space to such an astonishing level that you're never even going to be able to approach that with your puny little conscious mind, right? And so really the ability to output naturally, to have the right thing at the right time and be able to just, spit it out like a native speaker, you can't fake that. You can't fake that in Anki. It doesn't work like that. And I actually think that if you tried to do that, then you're going to end up perhaps saying unnatural things at unnatural times, right? Like, that's the dangerous thing about Anki, is that you're basically fooling your mind about the frequency of certain things. And so you could take a really uncommon phrase, and then you see it like 10 times in Anki over the course of a few months, and then your unconscious mind thinks that it's a relatively common thing to say. And so it's going to be throwing that to you when you're in the middle of a conversation. And even if you're able to see, oh no, I can't say that because that's really uncommon, it's still going to be annoying to have your brain feeding you things that are useless, and you have to like push them out of the way, right? If you just get authentic immersion, then you're going to be able to get into these flow states where whatever your brain throws you, it's going to be perfect. And so I would say that there's no shortcut, right? You got to just immerse. That's the only way. You can't watch my video on the role of the SRS. That's the only thing it's good for, right? It's good for helping you make mental dictionary entries so that you can take more from your immersion. All output ability comes from your immersion. And after you have been doing engaging in this process for a certain amount of time, this will become super obvious to you, right? Immersion comes from somewhere deep in your brain. You can't fake that. So yeah, I would say just keep immersing. Your memory's a lot. Once you get fluent, your brain's ability to acquire things from just a small number of circumstances and retain those and pull them out at the perfect time is much greater than it sounds like you are currently thinking. So that's all the questions for this week. Again, thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for your questions. And I'll see you guys in 2 weeks.